Hello everyone, and welcome to a new series on my channel called Skeletons in the Closet. The videos in this are going to be a bit more exploratory, a bit more conceptual, a little bit less analytical, numerical, and granular than the other essays that I've made, even though I've only made like 2 other ones. I'm gonna be honest, I was working on a bigger project and I lost a lot of motivation, so this is kind of a way for me to get back into things. But also the series is going to be exploring conventional wisdom, common ideas within the society and culture and discourse that I'm exposed to, and the disagreements that I have with a lot of the commonly held beliefs. With all that being said, my first skeleton in the closet has to do with labels in the LGBTQ+ community, which I will be calling the rainbow community for the remainder of this video, and the prevailing wisdom that, in particular, people who aren't a part of that community have about those labels. Part 1. The prevailing wisdom and my very good take that you should listen to instead. An idea that I hear over and over again is that rainbow folks focus on labels too much. After all, part of the rainbow community is the idea that we're all diverse and unique human beings, so the idea of classifying people into even more kind of buckets of different traits kind of seems to run counterintuitive to the point of the movement, right? And you never want to be defined by a label. If you have one at all, you should simply use it as a convenient shorthand for expressing the way that you feel. It should be your label. The label shouldn't be something that has control over you. And another common part of this prevailing wisdom is the idea that the field is evolving too quickly. It's too hard for people who aren't engrossed within these things to actually keep up with the way that terminology is evolving and concepts are evolving. I actually think there's a lot of really good stuff buried within this. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of very bad stuff buried within it, and I'll get to that in course, but I don't want to come off as though I'm bashing anyone who has this view. I understand the view, it makes a lot of sense, and I particularly understand how someone who doesn't have experience within the community could come to these conclusions. I do think there is a problem with people over-focusing or hyperfixating on having a label or a group of labels to define their exact experience with queerness. I do think that that is an issue. But a lot of this new terminology is coming about not just because people are over-fixating on this stuff, but also because a new technical field of queer theory is developing. And with a technical field comes technical terminology, right? An electrical engineer, if they're talking about a transformer to another electrical engineer, isn't just gonna say, this device that changes the voltage by using electromagnetic induction. They're going to say this transformer because that streamlines communication. That's the entire point of technical language, and not everyone on the planet needs to know what a transformer is for that technical terminology to be doing its work. So that's where some of the terminology comes from. But I do agree that there is some aspect and some people within the rainbow community that do overfixate or hyperfixate on having particular labels. But I view that as a facet of the culture in which they were raised, not the queer community, or rather the rainbow community as I'm trying to call it, but the dominant culture, the one that assumes that people are cis and straight and all this other stuff. But I'll get back to that later. The main disagreement that I have with this viewpoint is the undercurrent of blame that often underlies it. It often is accompanied by this notion that queer people are to blame for over-fixating on this, or for creating an environment where people will over-fixate on it. This idea that if rainbow people simply stopped focusing on labels too much, stopped focusing on identity so much, and got on with life, yeah, we'd just live along with you. Like, what's the big deal? Things would be just fine. And this ignores a lot of the subtext present in the dominant culture of many parts of the West in particular. As a rainbow person, their first interaction with these sorts of labels being assigned to them does not come from the rainbow community, it does not come from rainbow people, and it does not, and this is the most important part, it does not come from the individual's self-determination or self-exploration. Where it comes from is expectation of the dominant society. The most obvious example is that it is assumed that people are cisgender and that people who are assigned male at birth will prefer boyish things, the color blue, playing with trucks, etc., etc., whereas people who are assigned female at birth will enjoy the color pink, enjoy playing with dolls, whatever. And this is just one of the many ways that this manifests with clothing and toys and whatnot, and later on in life you also get these assumptions surrounding things like straightness, and if someone exhibits traits that are outside of what their gender is supposed to do, maybe that's indicative that they're gay or something. A lot of really weird shit, basically. In my case, even though no one explicitly told me to my face, hey, you're cisgender, that label was heavily implied to me through the way I was raised, and the label becomes further entrenched when no other option is presented. There was no alternative state of being to cisgenderness presented to me. I didn't know what a trans person was, I didn't know what a non-binary person was, until I had already repressed my non-binariness for many, many years. And I knew that something was wrong gender-wise from around about the age 10, but without any alternative in mind, I just assumed, oh, there's something wrong with me, this is just something that I have to just sort out, and whatever. This isn't a thing, even though it is a thing. That repression created a breeding ground in my mind for internalized transphobia and self-hate, and led me to have some really disgusting beliefs, which I still regret to this day. And I don't say that to excuse myself by any means. I take full responsibility for the fact that I was shit. But at the same time, it's one of the factors that led me to being this person, and that's not deniable. And the same can occur for gay and bi people, with a lot of gay people exhibiting internalized homophobia and lashing out at other gay people because they're scared of being perceived as gay themselves. Furthermore, these gay and bi people don't see non-straight relationships represented in media with the same degree of nuance that straight relationships get. And if you don't know that being different in a particular way is okay, and you never see it represented in a positive light, it can easily turn into this feeling that there's something wrong with you. And that's part of why representation is really important, but that's a side note for a different video. Getting back on topic, rainbow people are often socialized in a system that leads them to repress certain aspects of themselves and to associate a particular set of labels, straight, cisgender, etc., with being normal, quote unquote. This labeling process begins very early, so it's no wonder that when this conditioning is being broken down, people still try to use labels to make sense of things. It's not so much the language that we've been taught to use, but it's the medium through which we've been taught to kind of filter our thoughts. You could think about, in some ways, playing around with labels can be a form of exploring your identity, but while using terminology and thought patterns and ideas that you're familiar with, because you're familiar with this label structure that you were raised with. It can be a form of exploration while keeping the training wheels on, so to speak. But it can also be a great source of empowerment or a great source of rebellion against a system that has told you that you're something you're not for an awfully long time. If you were taught that you're label A your whole life when you aren't, then there's a real feeling of liberation and security and confidence in not just saying, I'm not label A, but in being able to point to this other thing, or this looks like I'm pointing at you, to point to this other thing and say, I'm not label A, I'm this other thing. Look, you were wrong. This is who I am. I can define myself in a positive. I don't have to define myself in a negative anymore. And that feels very stable and very affirming for a lot of people. Essentially, I think that this common view of rainbow people and labels and overfixation is born of a blind spot that a lot of people have towards cultural subtext and the cultural status quo. But why is such a blind spot so common then? Part 2. Intersectionality and the privilege of looking away. This blind spot that so many people seem to have surrounding the status quo may come from a lack of having to engage with the systemic problems within that status quo. Intersectionality theory can play a part here, which discusses the way that different forms of minority status can all intersect with one another. Members of one minority group, for instance rainbow people, may find it easier to empathize with the plight of another minority group, for instance Māori people in Aotearoa or other indigenous people. And this is often because criticism of the dominant social kind of way of things is something that minority groups are much more incentivized to do, or in some cases they just have to do it for their survival. Of course, I'm still probably not going to understand the struggles faced by Māori people as fluently as someone who is part of that specific group, because even though I'm used to criticizing the status quo, I'm not used to the types of criticism that need to be leveled for their specific plight. And I'm not trying to say that if you aren't a minority in some way you can't or won't or don't criticize the status quo. I'm saying that, for lack of a better word, the majority demographic has less of a reason to critically reflect on the status quo because oftentimes it's designed to benefit them. I mean, they're the majority demographic, right? They're who society is built for. Therefore, on average, these people may be more likely to have blind spots and biases that push them towards accepting and supporting the status quo. And here we get to the Dunning-Kruger effect. The idea that people who know a little bit about a field tend to think they know a lot about it. And conversely, the people who know a lot about a field tend to realize that they don't actually know all that much, because fields are deep. We know a lot of shit. We've been here for a while, you know? But how does that relate to rainbow issues or to minority issues more broadly? Well, I'm going to give two examples, one specifically pertaining to rainbow issues and one pertaining to other minority issues. Firstly, the entire prevailing wisdom I've been discussing about labels in the queer community, the rainbow community, ignores a large amount of cultural subtext. It's a perfect example of a lot of people who aren't equipped to talk about a topic comprehensively, trying to do that without seeking out the counsel of people who are equipped to have that conversation. This could be seeking out people who are more qualified, who are more knowledgeable, or who have more experience in the area. And a similar phenomenon occurs around race with crime statistics, with many people trying to claim that particular races are inherently criminal because they commit a disproportionately high amount of crime. In doing so, they strip the conversation of all of its cultural and historic subtext, differences in poverty rates, over-policing of certain areas, etc., etc., all of these factors which contribute towards these numbers. Some of the people who express these views know they're being reductive. Politicians spring to mind, particularly politicians who are trying to appeal to a very conservative, very right-wing kind of demographic. Some people don't know that this is reductive, though. Some people think that it's just a fair bit of analysis, and there can be a degree of willing ignorance there as well. This latter group are falling prey to the Dunning-Kruger effect just as much as they're falling prey to the misinformation and propaganda that they're being fed by the group who kind of know that they're being a bit reductive. So the conclusion to draw from that is that when it comes to weighty issues, I think that people should be a lot more mindful of their limits, or, a phrase that I prefer, should acknowledge their mortality. And what do I mean by that? Part 3, a conclusion recorded on a different day because the other takes weren't very good. To recap, the common idea that rainbow people focus too much on labels does hold some water, but the often accusatory presentation of this idea ignores a lot of cultural subtext. People are socialized into viewing themselves as having particular labels, straight, cisgendered, etc. And this occurs through the dominant culture assuming these things about them. Has nothing to do with rainbow culture. But this quote-unquote default set of labels that are imprinted upon us from a young age are so normalized to us, and in the case of most people, are accurate enough to the point where their omnipresence isn't noticed, and then rainbow culture can become a scapegoat for this kind of label-centric view of things. One possible reason for this lack of cultural understanding surrounding the dominant culture is the fact that not many people have to interrogate this particular aspect of the status quo. I mean, after all, most people are ascribed the label straight, and most people are straight. Therefore, they have no reason to think more deeply on the topic, because whatever the system is, it worked for them. And that's fine, and I'm glad that the system works for them, but when you have no reason to interrogate something and look into it more deeply, you're inevitably going to end up with a less fluent view of it. Combine this with the relative invisibility of rainbow voices when discussing these sorts of issues, and the fact that everyone seems to want to have an opinion on this topic without actually seeking out the people who kind of have experience in the field and know what it's like. So when you combine all of that stuff together, you end up with just a recipe for this sort of cultural blind spot to occur, and it's no surprise that it does. And this is where the phrase "acknowledge your mortality" is very useful, and even more useful than the phrase "knowing your limits." I don't quite like the phrase "knowing your limits," because who defines what your limits are? You can be up here with your view of yourself, and then define your limits as down here? Sure, and you can take yourself down a notch, but how do you know you've taken yourself down the right amount of notches? You can't, and you can try and be a decent judge of it, but us humans are notoriously terrible at judging our own abilities, with fields of psychology and cognitive biases and all sorts of stuff being devoted to explaining just how terrible we are at estimating our own ability. So there's a lot of room for error there, to put it mildly. And acknowledging your mortality addresses this concern by being a great equalizer. Everyone's mortal, and this doesn't just force you to kind of temper yourself slightly, bring yourself down slightly. No, it fully grounds you. It brings you back down to the earth and in line with your fellow human beings, where you can engage with them on equal footing and actually broaden your perspective and actually listen to people. And that's so much easier from down on the same level as them than it is if your head is so far up in the clouds. And that's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope I get to do another one of these soon. And I hope I get to see you in that other video, because these are good fun to make, and it's nice when people watch the stuff that I'm putting time and effort into. So I will hope to see you next time, whenever that is. Bye for now.